This week on The Futurists, Lauren Ducrey.
I can explain poetry to people all I want until you have heard a poem and you've felt in your body, how its music, how its rhythm, how its images move you. It's just not going to stick. It's like explaining the beauty of a song to you.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick, and this week I am solo because my partner Brett King is traveling around the world, as he frequently does. It's great that he does that because he always brings fresh, novel insights to our show and finds interesting people for us to interview. This week, we're going to get into a topic I'm thrilled to do. As everybody on the show knows, I'm very interested in the subject of language, storytelling, and how we construct meaning with stories. We've had a number of guests on the show in the past who've helped us think about the future of storytelling, and in some cases, related topics, like the future of copyright and the use of copyrighted material to construct technologies like artificial intelligence and so on. And so this is a topic that keeps presenting itself because the way we use language is going to affect the way we think, and that is going to affect the way we think about the future. So this week, it's a great privilege for me to introduce you to Lauren Ducrey. And Lauren has two interesting characteristics that made me so curious to get to know her. Lauren is a poet, and she's also worked with artificial intelligence. And in fact, today she's going to talk to us about the nexus of those two very different disciplines. Lauren, welcome to The Futurists. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you here. Tell me first, help my audience understand, what is it that you do and how did you arrive at this interesting, this sort of juncture of poetry and artificial intelligence?
Unexpectedly, I would say, first off. But yes, I'm a poet, now a keynote speaker, an AI designer. And I spent 7 years at Google designing the personalities of conversational agents like the Google Assistant, like Gemini. And in parallel, I also funded a program bringing the connective power of poetry to teams to foster trust and collaboration and just a more supportive workplace.
So poetry is an avocation of yours. That's like a passion that you've had.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't necessarily what Google was hiring you for. It just happened to be a passion that you had that informed what you did.
Yeah, I was hired as a creative writer so that I would say the ability to, harness the connective power of language was there. But my title, unfortunately, at Google was not to be a poet. So I brought that in myself and was met with a lot of excitement by people from all different job types.
Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting point. Sorry to bust in, but this is something that I would bet that some portion of our audience does not know. We tend to think of the technology companies as very engineering dominated. That's true. That's an accurate characterization, but that isn't the whole story. My experience working with technology companies on the West Coast is that there are a lot of creative thinkers in those companies. And actually engineers are creative thinkers, though we don't typically imagine that as like their first characteristic. And as a result, you'll find that many people working at technology companies on the side, they're writing, they're doing art, they're doing community work, they're engaging in other kinds of expressive activities. And so these are basically very smart people who happen to be good engineers, and they work in an engineering first environment. But there's a lot of untapped creative potential. So you discovered a way to kind of connect with that.
No, 100%. Thank you for naming that, because that is one of my biggest takeaways from my time there. So to give you a little bit of context, during COVID, obviously, like everyone else, we went remote with my team, although Google was rather well prepared for that. There was still all the anxieties and turmoil of facing COVID, and I wanted to test out bringing poetry again as this tool for human connection, which I personally knew it to be, but I wanted to try and bring it into the workplace. And so I piloted a workshop with my team, which went really well. And then at Google internally, there's a learning platform, and any employee can bring a program.
Oh, cool.
And so I did that. And people from all job types signed up. Engineers, the data analysts, the marketers, the HR folks. Obviously, I was part of UX. UX tends to be the more, I would say, artsy, humanities.
Yeah, that's as close to art as you can get in a technology company. UX design, right?
Exactly. And I kind of anticipated the UX folks to show up, but there was this wild array of different folks that showed up, all with this glimmer in their eye, saying, "I get to be creative here."
Oh, cool.
And I get to reconnect. For a lot of people, what I heard was I used to write when I was younger. And then I went to college, maybe continued writing in college, but then I got a job and I stopped. And so this was a way for them to reconnect with that creative writing, ability of theirs and leave. This was a second takeaway that I keep very near and dear to my heart. Leave feeling really energized when, you could think like, oh, you just took an hour out of your workday to do something unrelated. They left really energized and with a really important sense of belonging, because I would have them connect, not even through writing poems at first, just discussing poems as this, as these creative tables that allows to tap into emotion, but with that safe space. The poem is kind of doing a lot of the work, right? We're not asking you like, tell me about your life. It's more through this poem, what can you share about yourself with other people? And that sense of human connection was something that people were really thirsty for, and that's why they showed up.
That's really cool. And so, part of your experience, I'm assuming, is that in doing that, you discovered. Let me frame that a little bit differently. By helping your colleagues reconnect with their expressive potential and find a vehicle for expression, you actually unlocked some superpowers for the company.
Absolutely.
This is what I would love for you to talk a little bit about, like, because it's obviously not just appropriate for Google, right? You could do this for almost any organization. And in a way, it's sort of what you were just saying. People get busy in their lives. They may have these creative pursuits or inclinations, but then work takes over, life takes over, family takes over, and then the creative aspirations, they're not just put in the back seat, they're put in the trunk of the car, and you forget about them. Sometimes they're just left at home on the journey.
Yeah.
And then people have regret, like midway through their life, they're like, gosh, I used to be a creative person. Whatever happened? Here I am 30 years later. What the heck happened? So what you learned at Google could be appropriate for other companies. Tell me about that, if you could. Like, what is the takeaway benefit for the organization?
Totally. And I will say it definitely is appropriate for other companies because I actually left Google last year to dedicate myself full time to this work. So I have experienced it with other companies. And the main benefits, I would say, is that poetry is an accelerator to build trust and collaboration. I think those are two of the main takeaways. And I'll give you an example. I led a workshop with the C-suite of a pretty major food and beverage company. And I'd been brought in because they went through a significant reorg and there were new hires, right? So they needed to create that team cohesion, that team trust to be able to move forward effectively. And what I essentially had them do was craft their team manifesto in poetic language. And these people were not, they hadn't studied creative writing. We had the CFO in the room that was a very obviously like numbers orientated person. And what I got to witness was people discovering their teammates in a completely new light. And some of these people had worked together for years, and I heard like, I didn't know that you loved this or that, had this point of view on a thing, right? So discovering their teammates completely anew, really understanding the unique value that everybody brought into the room. Some of the feedback at the end was beautiful. It was true. Like, I now understand what everybody in this team brings to the table. Wow. I have renewed empathy for my coworkers.
Okay, that's a magnificent discovery. Did you actually ask them to write poetry, or were they using so simile and metaphor and symbology, or maybe they were using meter and rhythm and rhyme?
So I scaffolded things, right? Obviously to give people, kind of like guardrails to work with so that I wasn't just throwing them off the deep end. And we worked as our inspiration with a beautiful poem by Mary Oliver called The Journey, which really captures the initial struggles of, stepping out from your comfort zone to build something new, to go and like find purpose, and then eventually the process of finding it. So we use that poem as our inspiration. And then I had them basically write in kind of a Mad Lib structure. So we used the basic structure of the poem and I just had them replace some of the words. So when the poem was talking about obstacles, they had to represent like a metaphor for their obstacles. when the poem spoke about the speaker in the poem finding their purpose, I invited everybody to find, like, what is your metaphor within the team? You know, are you and we use the metaphor of the journey. So I was like, are you the map maker? Are you the binoculars? Are you the mountain in the distance? Are you the walking shoes?
That's cool.
So using metaphor as just a very simple distillation of poetic language. Because yes, I think people can hear poetry and they're like, wait, but what? I can't write a poem. I'm like, no, let's start simple. Just images and metaphors.
I love that idea. I'm, as you can see from the pictures behind me, I'm a painter and I draw. And the way we're taught to do art, or at least the way we used to be taught to do art, is to mimic the work or study the work of great artists. And of course you do that in writing. You read, you'll read all the great poets and the great writers, of course, to learn how to write yourself. But I've never heard anyone do that, like deconstruct a poem and replace parts. It makes perfect sense, because then you don't have to struggle with things like meter and rhythm, and actually even beyond that, just swapping out parts the way you're describing it. It also allows everybody to focus on the same poem, so you don't have to contend with everybody reading their own individual poem and then everyone in the room trying to figure out what they're talking about. That could take an enormous amount of time. So it's a little bit more time efficient to work this way with everyone focused on the same structure.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that point of efficiency. I also wanted them to collectively write a poem that would also capture their individual contributions, and that's really important to me in these sessions that are focused on trust building and collaboration. And another reason for bringing in the poem quite early on was also just to give them a direct lived experience of poetic language, because I can explain poetry to people all I want until you have heard a poem and you've felt in your body, you know, how its music, how its rhythm, how its images move you. It's just not going to stick. It's like explaining the beauty of a song to you. You know, you just need to listen to the song.
You can dissect the song and then you kind of killed it. You know, there it is.
Exactly.
I think helping people deal with metaphor and analogy, I think it's a really powerful thing. It's a noble undertaking, because we live in a very literal society. People are very, very, very literal. And I hate to say uncreative, because there is a tremendous amount of innovation happening around us, but it's always in the service of something else, you know. So it's never art for art's sake. It's never, the magic of comparing something that you've observed with something that we already know, and thereby discovering a connection that perhaps wasn't evident. It's not about that idea, that spirit of discovery and the kind of joy of expression. Instead, it's always in the service of something else. You know, so for instance, anyone with poetic imagination in a corporation would typically be in the marketing department,
Yes.
banging out marketing copy or social media marketing. And it's like, oh gosh, that is like using a Maserati to move furniture. It's just a terrible use of that skill. And I can imagine that person feels soulless when they go home, and that's like, this is not what I was put on this planet to do.
Right.
So do you run into literalism? Like, do you run into people who have an inability to think in metaphor or think about an analogy? Do you find that some people have that problem?
That's a really good question. So far, I truly have not.
Then you may be teaching me a great technique that I can use, because I do run into this quite frequently, where I'm dealing with people and half the people are speaking metaphorically and the other half of the people literally do not understand them, right? They're like, wait, what? Where do you just took the conversation into this weird place. I can follow it. I like it, right? I think it's helpful.
Yeah.
But for some people, they don't find it helpful. They find it confusing.
I mean, I think that there's just truth to that, and meeting people where they are is always deeply important to me, like as an educator, as a workshop facilitator. And it's maybe introducing to people the metaphors that are already in their life that they don't even realize. I mean, in the corporate world, they're used all the time. Now, maybe people don't resonate with these either, you know, like drinking from the fire hose, building the plane or flying the plane while you build it, building the plane while you fly it. That's the one. And maybe that's
true.
A way in.
Well,
it's all over the place.
Yeah, that's true. We use those kinds of metaphors. They're very good examples you just gave. It's true. You know, we're the airplane's taxiing down the runway and we're trying to change the engine, and that's like a reference to making design changes at the last minute for a product that's about to launch, for instance, or changing the engine while the airplane is in the air. Another example. We've already deployed a service on the web and we have to swap out some microservices. How do we keep the thing going? But that's a boring way of saying it. So instead we use this colorful metaphor, and people seem to understand that. But those have now become so overused,
Yes.
so shop worn, so threadbare that we don't even think of their metaphorical power anymore. They just become a substitute for an idea, right? They're like a shorthand, if you will.
Exactly.
So in a way, that's the opposite function, right? Because the function of metaphor or analogy is to cause you to see something afresh, to cause you to see something in a new way, to cause you to make a new connection, a novel connection that hadn't occurred to you before. That's the vitality in poetry. That's the function of poetry. When we use these cliche terms, it's the exact opposite. What we're doing is we're shortcutting. We're sparing ourselves the cognitive effort of having to make the connection ourselves. We're sparing ourselves the words to actually describe the real situation. So instead, we substitute this commonly understood metaphor that everybody gets, and we can just all move on. It's a kind of groupthink, but often I think it's dangerous because it causes people to overlook the complexity of the situation. When we talk about it with stereotypical terms, we're actually failing to describe it accurately.
It's like it's ossified what it's trying to describe, and that what was once true is no longer true. So you're missing out. Absolutely. Yeah.
You're reminding me of George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, which I've been reading lately because if you're curious about what's happening in the federal government in the United States right now,
Timely.
it's a great time to read George Orwell's essays. I'm not talking about the book 1984 or the other book, Animal Farm. His essays. He was first and foremost an essayist, and he wrote about the use of language, and he wrote about these kinds of shortcuts that people make where they substitute a block of words for original thinking. And he talks about shop-worn metaphors that are a substitute for original thought and what they do to people's ability to think. Because this is the thing about language. Language is an operating system for society, right? Language is how we construct meaning. It's how we express meaning. If you're just stringing together a bunch of cliches, you're not really thinking. Gosh, that certainly wasn't what you expected to be talking about this morning for this
Oh,
call.
I'm not that surprised. And I would actually, I think we know that language shapes, how we think. And I would even go one step further. It also shapes how we feel. And I know that can seem counterintuitive, and that the lived experience might seem like, oh, I have an emotion, right? I feel like heat in my chest or my cheeks are flushed. And then I name that excitement, anger, stress, whatever that is for you. But there's actually really fascinating research that, to me, is an argument for getting more curious about poetic language. The research is by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and her major book is called How Emotions Are Made. And she basically flips the view that we all have universal emotions, that they all show up the same way physiologically, neurologically, and that actually we construct emotions in reaction to certain circumstances, and that the language that we use to name certain emotions has a huge impact on how we construct them. So if we're used to calling, a certain emotional feeling sadness, but we're not differentiating between soft sadness or let's say melancholy, and you're more passing nostalgia, you might actually be lumping together very different experiences. And then that takes away your ability to have self-awareness about, oh, I know this is actually nostalgia, this is actually melancholy, and I respond to those in different ways. So it's what she says, that the more granular your language, the better your self-awareness, and almost the better your ability to choose how you respond emotionally in different instances.
That's very powerful insight. Yeah, that's really, that resonates with me on a personal level, but I'm actually thinking in terms of the corporation once again. When relationships get intense in companies, and they often do, people disagree vehemently and sometimes emotionally, but they can't, it's a little perplexing, right? If you're looking at from the outside, if you're looking at an organization from the outside, say as a consultant or an advisor, it's a little perplexing. People get so emotional. It's like, it's just business. Like, why is this personal to you? Why are you getting, but part of the problem is that people cannot name their emotions. They're not able to put a label on what they're feeling. Or they're being confronted with information that so challenges what they hold dear in themselves. Maybe concepts that are so integral to themselves, they haven't articulated them, so they can't put a name on that, what they truly believe or what they stand for, that it feels like a threat to their identity, which feels like an attack. And so they respond as if they're being attacked. I see this happen frequently, and I often wonder about it myself. A therapist and I had a conversation about this, and she pointed out that men in particular
Hmm.
are unable to name emotions. And of course,
Hmm.
I said, well, I'm a man. I said, no kidding. And we talked about it, but in 5 minutes, she revealed to me that, in fact, it was true for me. I don't know if it's true for all men, but certainly for me. And that sent me off on a journey to understand this better because I discovered that the way I was raised, at least if you're a boy, you're not meant to feel certain feelings, and you're certainly
Totally.
not meant to express them. It's like, come on, be a big boy.
Hmm.
Play football. It's like you're not hurt. Get back out there in the field. Oh, I'm
Tough
not
enough.
hurt. Okay, so you start to repress even physical sensations, and as a result, an adult, you have a very hard time articulating an emotional set of circumstances. And when you can't articulate what's going on, yes, you can't form thoughts about it, right? And if you can't form thoughts about it, then you're not going to be able to devise an action plan or a coherent you're not able to process it in a way where you can take a reasonable action. And that is how people respond in irrational ways. Unfortunately, this seems like something that's spreading through the whole world right now. And when you read the newspaper every morning, you're like, oh, here's more examples of irrational thinking, people concocting these elaborate narratives
Yeah.
that aren't really based in reality because they can't confront what's actually happening within themselves.
And I think that self-awareness piece is one that I'm deeply passionate about in the use of poetry. I always say that poems are mirrors for us to better see ourselves, because they do this amazing thing where they're made of language, which is something that we all use, right? And I adore paintings, I adore music, I adore all the art forms, but poems are made of language, this like rational construct that we all use. But they use it to go beyond language. They kind of flip language on its head, right? They put words together that you would never have expected to see, or they create a musical rhythm that goes beyond language to evoke and elicit your emotions, your imagination, and your intuition. And so when you're reading a poem, again, you have this easy entry. It's like, okay, it's language. Let me read this. And then it's gonna trigger you in some way or another. It might be, not liking the poem because you don't understand what it means,
Mhm.
or it might be a deep sense of delight for this one metaphor. Whatever emotional reaction you're having, you can then come back to the poem and go back to this familiar thing that's language to start and unpack that reaction that you had and realize, like, oh yeah, there's no punctuation in this poem. That's really annoying to me because I like when things are structured. Or this one image of, the dog on the corner of a street reminded me of my childhood when da 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 da. And suddenly you're able to have a much more intimate relationship with that emotion. And you might not even be naming it yet, right? You don't need to name that it's nostalgia or joy or whatever it is, but it gives us this like first doorway. And that's what I see when I work with poems. It's like, okay, can we just use them to understand like what's going on with us? And then the poem becomes this proxy to talk about ourselves, which can again be a little bit easier than, you mentioned therapy can be challenging because you're truly being asked to like talk about yourself in a pretty clear way. Here the poem becomes a bridge again between all these emotions, this intuition that's below the surface, and your rational, logical mind. And that bridge is language.
I love the conversation, but I'm so curious as we're talking. What's in the back of my mind right now is
Yeah.
I'm thinking, how do you present this to companies? Like, who is it that you sell this proposition to, and what is it that they think they're buying when they hire you to come to their company and do this for them?
So that's a great question. So I introduce myself as a poet, but also as an AI designer. And that intersection to me is also, it's very dear. I think it's uncanny again that I came from the world of literature, was hired into a tech company to design these AI tools, and was at the forefront and still am at the forefront of, designing large language models. So I'm like, okay, there's something about language here. So I always introduce myself as a poet and as an AI designer, but what I really emphasize on is empathetic communication and like how can we use our language in an era where AI is also based on language to unlock skills that AI cannot replace. Typically our emotional intelligence.
Super.
And to me, one of the biggest, I would say, tools to develop your emotional intelligence is your language, are your communication abilities.
Maybe the only way, right? You can demonstrate it through actions, but that's pretty intangible for most.
Exactly. Because again, like we said, the words you use, they're going to impact how you think about yourself, how you think about your emotions, how you manage your emotions. And then those words are also going to help you connect with other people, understand how other people are thinking and feeling to create those, healthy work relationships that you need to get to your goal, your project goals, your deadlines, to talk to your leadership and pitch an idea. So I focus on how we can, or how important it is to master empathetic communication to thrive in this age of AI. And then I'll use, in certain cases, poetry or AI, depending on how comfortable the organization is. It really varies. Some companies are quite open to the more artistic angle because they know that it just gets people into a state of presence and in that growth mindset that you want. And sometimes the entry point is AI, and I'll have people actually use large language models to prepare for difficult conversations. That has been one of the big topics that I've been pushing and talking about.
Great topic. And you brought us right up to the brink of artificial intelligence, which we definitely want to get into, but now we have to take a little break. So folks, you're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tursik, and this is my guest, Lauren Ducrey, who is a poet who's an expert in artificial intelligence. And we're going to learn more about the intersection of language and artificial intelligence right after the break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tursik, and this week I'm interviewing a poet who knows about artificial intelligence, Lauren Ducrey. Thank you very much for joining The Futurists this week. So one of the things our audience may not know, but they should if they check out your bio at laurenducrey.com. They'll learn more about your background because your presentation on your website is in both French and English. And so these are two sides of your personality. Now, as we're talking right now, you seem like a very typical American person, a thoughtful American. But we could be having this conversation in French, or you could, probably not me. Tell me a little bit about being raised bilingual.
Happily. I think it is the first of the two hats that I've kind of worn my whole life. So my mom's American, my dad is French. And I very much grew up at the intersection of two cultures, two languages. My parents did a terrific job at really not just conveying language to us, but truly culture. And I think that allowed me to develop at a pretty young age an appreciation for the many different points of view that exist on reality. Not to get too philosophical, but I'll actually give you a very specific example. So I'd spend my summers in the States visiting American family before going back to Paris, where I went to school. And I discovered chipmunks one summer and decided that chipmunks were my favorite animal, being so incredibly adorable. And so I was very excited to come home to my school friends and tell them all about chipmunks. And then I got to school and I was like, I don't know how to say chipmunk in French. So I went home and I asked my parents, and they didn't really know. They're like, there actually isn't really a word for chipmunk. And
there's no chipmunk in France.
Because there are no chipmunks in France. And I remember having just a mind-blowing, I was maybe 6 years old, having this mind-blowing aha moment that language, reflects different realities, but therefore there's not perfect parity between languages. And that just stuck with me. And my bilingualism has definitely been a guiding light in my career and in my work.
It is quite interesting how learning a different language causes you to understand. You have this sort of flash of insight that the people who speak that language natively actually construct meaning differently.
Yes.
And different languages function in different ways. Of course, English is inflected with so much French. There's a blending there, right? A lot of French linguistic concepts are buried in English or embedded in English. When I learned German, I was really struck because German has very precise grammar rules, and you can reorganize words and you can take participles and move them around, and it actually changes the meaning of the word. You can build new words with it. And it struck me at the time that, and Japanese seems to work in a similar principle. It's no surprise those two countries are great at engineering. and I know I'm making a gross generalization right now, but it's the language ability allows you to sort of understand how to construct things and move things around. And I think that does actually express itself in national character. Maybe I'm on the brink of making generalizations that aren't going to be very supportive, so I could probably pull back from that. But
No, I think,
inviting you to chime in and opine on the subject.
yeah. Now, this brings to mind two examples that I love. One is relative to the structure of different languages. So French typically has, a subject, verb, complement, rest of the sentence, versus German that has the verb at the way end of a sentence. And the impact that that has in conversation is that it's very easy to interrupt in French because you get so much substance at the very beginning of a sentence, whereas in German, you have to wait until the end of a sentence.
True.
And so you can't interrupt. And so you'll have these different discursive and conversational styles in different cultures, but just simply based on the structure of a language. But that you can imagine can lead to different rules of politeness and just different rules of being in society. And if you don't know, it's just difficult to apprehend them. And now when you look at the structure of a language, if you're going to a country to, do business or even just for enjoyment, you could start to understand like how they talk based on the structure of their language.
Certain people wield those linguistic powers magnificently. I remember Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, would give those very long sentences, very typical of German. But the key verb at the very end, he could kind of gauge the reaction of the room as he was speaking and change the verb or change the tense of the verb and put it in a conditional or something, dative version or something, depending on the reaction that he expected to get from the room. And so you had to really wait to get to the punchline in German. There's also like the sense of humor, I think, also is a derivative from language, or it can be affected by language. For instance, in German, you can move a couple of words around and completely invert the meaning of if you say er ist intelligent in German, that means he is intelligent. But if you say intelligent ist er, that means the exact opposite, right? You're sort of bringing the whole principle into question. Linguistically, they're the equivalent, but the meaning implied is quite different. The meaning that it's carrying. I love this idea. Let's take 1 second to notice that there's an awful lot of French in English. I mentioned that a moment ago. And the history of the English language reflects it. The example I love to give is that when we think about animals in a barnyard, the words are always German words. A cow, well, German word is Kuh. A hen, German word is a Hund, right? And the pig, the German word is Schwein, right? Swine. But when those animals are served in the kitchen and end up on the plate inside the house, we have all the French words, right? So suddenly we don't talk about a hen on your plate. We talk about poultry, right? Poultry being the French word poulet, and the same. It works across the board, right? So we don't serve people cow or beef flesh, which they would call it in German. We serve them beef, right? Boeuf, the French word. And that is true across the board. So like basically when the animal's out in the yard, the people in the yard are speaking German.
Yeah.
And the people inside the manor house who are eating the food, they're speaking French. And actually that is the history of England, right? That's the William the Conqueror and the conquest of England by the Normans in 1099. And there it is on the dinner plate every single night. It's on the menu in the restaurant. A little bit of English history and language history embedded in the menu of your restaurant.
I love that.
It's fun to think about it that way. So when you think about these things in the context of artificial intelligence, these, basically prediction machines, right? They're going to predict tokens, predict a series, like the most likely next word to complete a sentence. And I know that's a very reductive way to describe an LLM, but at some level it is accurate. At least that's the origin point. You were tasked with creating French personalities for machines. I am so curious, and I want to know more about that mission. If you can talk about it, if that's not something confidential to your work at Google.
I won't reflect any trade secrets, but yes, I was hired. This was now 8 years ago to develop the French version of the Google Assistant, or I would say the French version of the personality of the Google Assistant, because these virtual assistants, do many things that are very practical, but what we call the personality was any question that addressed the assistant like a character. So, are you a robot? Do you have feelings? Tell me a story. Tell me a joke. the team I was on was tasked with writing answers to those questions. Now, back in the day, this was pre-LLM. So we were actually creating all of that content. And the assistant had been conceived as a character. And a character in a movie, a character in a novel. It had, personality traits. And so my job was to translate those traits to be culturally and linguistically relevant to French-speaking users. And so you mentioned humor earlier. I think in France, we would call American humor maybe a bit like saccharine and, a little bit too soft. So the French version had very slight tones of sarcasm. Very slight, again, because the point was not to reinvent a personality. It was more just to allow it to speak to international audiences the same way that I am the same person, but I know how to speak to Americans and I know how to speak to French people. So that was my job. And I was on a team with a bunch of different international writers who all had that same task of transcreating, as we called it, the personality of an agent to different cultures.
That sounds like a pretty creative challenge. Did you find that creative work?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And mainly because it was important not to translate literally. And transcreation is really translating the underlying cultural and emotional references. So it was understanding what is going to resonate. And I think it got even more creative when the assistant was launched beyond France in 17 other French-speaking countries. So we had Switzerland, we had Belgium, we had Morocco, Algeria, Senegal, and that brought the work of transcreation to a whole new level. I had the opportunity in my previous job to work with folks from Western Africa. So I'd been exposed to different linguistic habits, where there was more like a mix of French with local languages. We did a bunch of research and, tested out answers that for most of them did mix French, local language, and then local references. And it did resonate with folks better than if we just used the French version.
Well, that's super interesting. I would have assumed that you would work with, kind of like the official Académie Française version, of France, the sort of high French. That doesn't resonate. That doesn't feel like a normal person. And these machines, to give us I guess fool us or to get us to believe that you're talking to a person, right? To infuse them with a personality that's believable. They have to sound like a regular person. They can't sound like they come from the academy.
Yes, and I think more so it was really speaking the user's language to be as useful as possible. And I would say that our team was very bullish not on making the assistant sound like a person, but more like its own character. So really conceived of it as a character, like a fictional character that simply knew how to speak to these different audiences in their own language.
That's cool. Okay, so then it's like writing for animation. It's like you're designing a character in a show. Okay, and
it was almost at the intersection of, gaming, screenwriting, but the tool is a virtual assistant versus being a character in a game or a character in a movie.
Now, today, you use artificial intelligence. You're an advocate for artificial intelligence. You use it in your work. Tell me about your experience as a creative person using AI.
Great question. I think there's two ways that I use AI. One, as I would say almost a business assistant, right? To support me as a solo creative. And I think that's an amazing opportunity. I've created bots to help me with my sales strategy, with my business strategy, with some copywriting, mainly tasks that I'm either not an expert in and just realistically can't become an expert in. And, in an ideal world, I would have a whole team that can do these things, or tasks that are really, really repetitive and that I don't find that much creative benefit in. So I'm a writer, and do I use AI for copywriting? Yes. When it's, editing a piece of copyright on my website, am I getting a lot of creative energy from that? No. And those are situations where I feel completely fine using AI. And then when it comes to pure creativity, there's different ways that I use AI. I have my poetry mentor that helps me edit pieces that I've written, but I always start my writing process sans AI, fully organic. It's me and the page. And then I've also worked on projects where AI is an integral part of the creative process. So I'll give you an example. There's two that come to mind. So I created this project called Young Letters to a Young Algorithm in reference to the poet Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, which has been one of my guiding books as a poet. And the idea here was, okay, this AI revolution is giving us these tools that promise to give us all the answers, right? You can ask anything to ChatGPT and it seems like it has an answer, but at the same time, the answers aren't always factual. So it's creating this new level of uncertainty, whereas poetry has always been very comfortable being in the questions, being in the not knowing. I think poems ask more questions than they offer answers. So what if I could use AI to ask more interesting questions? And so I created a custom GPT, and the way I interact with it is that I give it a poem. It asks questions that I've trained it to be completely surrealist, like questions that a human would never ask. So it asks me these completely wild questions, and then I respond with my own wild question. And then it gives me another wild question in response to my wild question. So
the GPT is prompting you, and you're the intelligence. You're responding. I love that. That's great.
It was like, how can I get it to prompt me to stretch my ability for divergent creative thinking? And so the piece that I've created as a result is this kind of exquisite corpse of AI question, my question, AI question, my question. And it's been really interesting, again, to use it to push my own divergent thinking, which is hard to do because these models are so probabilistic. I'm like, how can we make them not so probabilistic?
You're right. That we were talking about literalism before, and if you take any AI, any chat bot at face value, the way it's presented to you, without being very cautious or thoughtful about how you write your prompts, you're going to get extremely literal answers. That's their default response. It's about as literal as it gets, and it's also kind of average in sense of writing. It's not going to be very original writing. By design, that's not an accident. That's what they're designed to do. But what I think some people who are dismissive of AI chatbots, they try them and they get that response, and then they're like, "Well, it's not very good writing. It's not very original writing. Therefore, it's not useful to me." I think they're missing something. I think they're missing the potential. If you just push a little bit further, you can get into a very weird zone with a chatbot very quickly. And this, to me, is super creative, right? Because now it's like talking to an alien intelligence. And like you say, if you're curious about that, you can go right down that rabbit hole, and it will start to tell you strange and extraordinary things that provoke a lot of creative connections on your own part. So there you're talking about AI as a creative assistant. And I think this is a really valid thing to do. I do the exact same thing for my paintings. I use Midjourney now to generate paintings. And folks on the show have heard me rhapsodize about it. I was very resistant in 2022 when people were like, you should use Midjourney. And I thought it was terrible. I thought DALL-E 3 was terrible. I thought the results looked like clip art. I'm like, I have no use for that. But the models have improved, as they always do. And I got a little bit cleverer about how I write my prompts. So now I can get the result I'm looking for. And I think for artists, that's always the missing piece with any generative system, is the feeling of control. I want to feel like I'm getting the result I intend, not just some random, slot machine result. I want to actually, set out to create an artistic effect. And if I can get that with AI, well, then great, I'm satisfied and I'll keep using it. And I've achieved that with some of these tools, not 100% of the time, but enough where I find it to be quite useful. There are places where it doesn't work so well. Right now, video is extremely difficult to control, but I think that's a moment in time.
Yeah.
I think over time, we're going to find more and more ways to control it. What's interesting to me about video as a problem is it's also a language problem. If you're using generative AI, you have to use the language to describe the shot. And this presents all sorts of challenges. First of all, a lot of the people in the motion picture business are not word people. The writers are, screenwriters are, they're great with words, but most of the people in the motion picture business are picture people. And the business is telling a story with pictures, right? It's more about making pictures. And yet the video models haven't been trained on cinematic language. And so they don't always understand what you mean by things like a focus pull or, the terminology that we would use, aperture or the lens or something, focal length. These are words that don't mean anything to an AI. They haven't been trained that way. The data that it was trained on wasn't labeled in such a way. And so the AI may not have that concept. Now, of course, that's something that the company that make video models are focused on right now. So that's being fixed.
That's changing. Yeah.
That statement I just made will probably be out of date in 6 months. But at the moment, this is a fundamental challenge. If you're a cinematographer, you're going to get a bad result with most of the video models because they literally don't understand the language you're giving them, the instructions you're giving them. And then what you do to get a performance from an AI today is you have to get metaphorical, right? We're right back to poetry because you have to get a little bit more creative. You can't be so literal with the instructions and say, I want a dolly shot with with a jib arm and a soft move and a reverse angle. That language won't get you the result that you want. So then you have to start to think of the effect you're creating and find words to describe the effect. And I would say that's not really how we speak on a film set. So that language doesn't exist for most of the people on a crew. But if you want to get that result from Runway or you want to get that result from Luma, you're going to need to learn to develop that language, sort of a metaphorical way of speaking to the AI. And lo and behold, Lauren, we're right back at poetry, aren't we? We're talking to AI using poetic language.
Where all good things come from. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that one thing that comes up often in conversations about AI and artistry and the threat of AI and artistry is that I think it's the people who are the best at using AI to make art are artists. Mm-hmm. And those that have a good command of language is absolutely true. I think so far, I think what's confusing for folks is what you're exactly describing is like how technical should they get on certain tools? How metaphorical do they need to get on certain tools? We don't have the parity. There's no homogenous rules on like how to interact with these tools. So when people get frustrated, I'm like, this is actually what makes it very close to learning a craft is that there's no easy way in. It takes a lot of patience. It's like if you've never used a paintbrush or if you've never mixed colors. I remember trying to mix colors a few months ago and realizing how difficult it is. It's kind of the same thing. And you're going to have to pick your tool, get to know it really, really well, understand what type of language it works with. So it's humbling in that way because I think there's this false sense of, oh, this tool is going to do everything for me kind of perfectly. And no, you need to understand it first and foremost, and then you also need to...
And it will not be a perfect result, right? And you have to be okay with that, like imperfection. You have to find the beauty in the imperfection, I think. Okay, so as you just said, every AI model is a little bit different. Every one of these chatbots is a little bit different. Which one's your favorite one for writing poetry?
I have a soft spot for Claude.
Oh, me too. I think for language, this kind of expressive language,
totally.
I 100% agree with you. I don't know what it is, and I almost feel like it's in my imagination, but it works for me. If I'm writing creatively, if I'm trying to, even for marketing copy, I find Claude is more expressive. It uses language in a fresher way. I find the others are very pedestrian, the language that you'll get back. And then you have to do a lot more work to get the language, to get the written material where you want it to be. But with Claude, it comes out quite nice. It's very expressive.
Yeah, I think the only other one that I'll sometimes, double check with is ChatGPT, and especially in the newer versions. I think there were leaps and bounds that I had kind of missed because I just went with Claude maybe a year ago and stayed with it, and then I went back to ChatGPT and was like, okay, they've definitely leveled up on the creative expressiveness. But
for the folks that are listening this week, OpenAI just released a new version of ChatGPT to all users. And it has a whole range of new capabilities. And by the way, I haven't used it yet, so you're reminding me I need to spend the weekend playing with it to get familiar with it. This is this kind of cat and mouse game that's happening, or I don't know, it's like a foot race. Every one of the AI companies is constantly introducing new capabilities. The models keep learning; they keep getting better. As the new capabilities are introduced, your experience as a user is going to change, and you have to keep trying different models and new products as they come out. Lots of great new software coming out of China, open source software, which actually puts these American companies, these West Coast AI giants, on the defensive because they're rolling out, proprietary software and they're competing against open source. I thought that was like they had all embraced that 10 years ago. And here we are, seemingly we're on the wrong side of history with closed source proprietary software once again. Okay, so there is a question of authenticity in art, and many creative people I know refuse to use AI Many writers that I know will not use AI, and they feel that it lacks integrity. They use phrases like they'll say ChatGPT is a plagiarism machine, which I don't think is actually true. And I think people who say that don't know what plagiarism is, they're using the word loosely, maybe metaphorically, but they don't like it. They're not comfortable with it. Fair enough. I get it. There's a feeling a lot of artists have. If you don't suffer, if you don't do the thing by hand yourself, you're not a real artist. And yet we think, well, wait a minute. Rubens had a studio. Rembrandt had a studio. Many, Andy Warhol had a studio, right? Artisans who worked at their direction, kind of a corporate process towards creating art. Anyone that's worked in motion pictures or any other large-scale artistic endeavor, game design is another, game production, knows that these are collaborations of hundreds of people, all towards a creative objective. And each of those people uses tools.
Yes.
So tell me about your own feeling of authenticity. Do you suffer from this concern? Is this an issue for you that when you're using an AI as an assistant to do creative work, do you feel like the end result is inauthentic? Do you feel this lack of integrity?
The use of AI that I find most interesting as a creative, as an artist, is to do things that I can only do with AI. So if it was generating a poem, that's like not that interesting to me, because it is just kind of reproducing the process of what I do, and actually not even perfectly, because when I sit down to write a poem, I like to think that I know what I'm going to write about. That is not true. I always discover the poem as I write it. And that's more difficult to do when you're in a back and forth with AI, because that process of emergence is maybe less linear. It still happens. I think in conversation with AI, I'll have ideas. It'll spark something, right? It'll say something, and it's not even what it said that's that interesting. It'll just cause a reaction in my mind, and then that will give me an idea, and then that will turn into a poem.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the generation itself to me is not that interesting. It's more, what could I not do before that I can now do with AI? You could think of things like, what if I wrote a poem based on like a 300-page report that I would never, have the time to write myself, for instance. So thinking about scale.
Mm-hmm.
Another example, and actually this is what excites me the most with AI and art, is the ability to translate one medium into another.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously text to image feels very obvious, but what about image to text?
Mm-hmm.
The poetry camera that was created by Kellen Zhang, that I got to actually speak with on stage. It was one of those like moments in lifetime moments for me. She created a camera that takes visual input. It looks like a Polaroid camera, so the design is beautiful. It takes visual input and it turns it into a poem. So the camera actually prints out a poem of what it sees. That, to me, like, that is what I want to see. And there's a poetry clock that I believe this British gentleman created. So it gives you the time as a few lines of poetry. There's a haiku calculator where you can calculate and it'll give you the answer as a haiku. I'm like, that's what I want to see more of.
So this kind of alchemy, it's like a transmutive power of the language models, because they can, multimodal input and multimodal output means that you can be multimedia in your thinking. It's true. Someone said to me, you can input a song and ask it to generate a video. Yeah. Not a music video, but just a scene inspired by a song. And I'm like, wow, we've never really done that before. That's novel and new. Artists have been inspired by other art, of course. They have the long history of paintings inspired by poetry, poets inspired by paintings, and so forth. But here you have this great machine that can do it for you in 15 seconds, and it opens up the expressive playing field a little bit. I like the fact that you use it for upstream ideation, because I find that that's one of the great advantages, automating ideation. I can spend an afternoon and maybe I'll come up with 5 sketches that I think are okay, but not finished. With Midjourney, I can generate 1,700 images in an afternoon, and it's incredibly fun, and it feels incredibly artistic. They're all just departure points, but I'd rather have 1,700 departure points than 5. Like, to me, that more is better in that case. I'm ultimately going to pick one to go explore as a painting, and I'll do that by hand, the same way you do your poetry. But I just love the diversity of departure points, and frankly, that's artistic in itself. Like, that actually feels like a result, that experience of generating zillions of ideas and sifting through them. I find that pure joy. It's like eating potato chips. You can't stop.
Yeah, in the visual realm, I think that's particularly true. I think the equivalent that I found in text, and I use this with clients, and I don't think many people still understand how powerful this is. It's brainstorming with AI. I'm using it through role play. So truly asking it, play the role of an alien and Mary Oliver.
That's right.
And then we're going to engage in conversation. And again, that just stretches the boundaries of what you would have thought of. And I did it the other day for this workshop, and I was just testing out the prompt to make sure that it would work in the workshop. I was getting ideas.
It's great. You can say to the AI, you are a wise-ass 16-year-old kid. I want you to tell me that, the way that person would in that persona. And it will. And it's really quite good at that, right? It's not perfect, but it's quite good. And it's instant.
And you don't need it to be perfect. Again, it's just a sparring partner, right? This isn't user research. This is truly like, help me see my blind spots. Help me see what I'm not seeing. And I think that's another way. It's asking AI, tell me what I have not thought about in this project. And you give it all the context, and it will point out the blind spots. I think that is incredibly powerful.
Yeah. What are all the arguments against my proposition? Here's my argument. Tell me all the arguments against it so I can be prepared for that. Well, very powerful stuff. Lauren, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you. I think it's time for me to bring the show to an end. I could probably continue with you all day long. I'd certainly love to have you come back on the show, because
I would love that.
These large language models are evolving fast. AI is moving at a blistering pace, partly because of the pressure from these open source models that are getting so good. There's such a rapid proliferation and such a rapid advancement of technology that I think we should have you back. And maybe in a year or so, we can take a look and see how things have changed.
Let's do it.
But until then, where can people find out more about you and learn more about your work?
So my website, laurenducrey.com, is a great reference. And then I'm quite active on LinkedIn, Lauren Ducrey. I share all of these topics that we touched upon, from the unlocking emotional language in companies to riffing on poetry and AI creativity. That's where you can find me.
That sounds great. Thank you for joining the Futurists. And folks, every week, we're going to bring you another person who is thinking about the future and doing what they can to influence it, shape it, redirect it, maybe mold it. We enjoy doing this very much. I want to give a shout out to the folks at Provoke Media to make the show possible. Our engineer, Kevin Hirschhorn, our producer, Elizabeth Severance, my business partner, Brett King, who unfortunately could not be here. I know he would have relished this conversation, but we'll be back next week with another person who is thinking about the future. And until then, we will see you in the future. Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did, please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.